Have you ever made a decision that felt wrong, but somehow also felt necessary? Have you ever stood at a crossroads knowing that whichever path you chose, something important would be left behind? And have you ever looked back at your life and wondered, what would have happened if you had been just a little braver, or maybe a little more careful? Today, I want to tell you a story, not a story about success, not a story about failure, but a story about decisions, the kind that quietly shape a life over many years. Some of them felt exciting at the time, some of them felt terrifying, and some of them didn't feel important at all until much later. The first risky decision I ever made didn't look risky at all. In fact, to everyone around me, it looked safe, very safe. I was 24 years old. I had just graduated. And like many people, I was searching for something that felt like stability, a job, a routine, a predictable future, something my parents could feel proud of, something my friends would respect. When I got the offer, I didn't hesitate. It was a stable office job, good salary, fixed hours, a clear path forward. It was everything I thought I needed. I still remember my first day. The office was clean, quiet, organized. Everyone moved with purpose, but without urgency. There was no chaos, no uncertainty, no risk. And at first, I loved it. I loved waking up knowing exactly what my day would look like. I loved having a schedule. I loved receiving a paycheck at the end of the month without worrying about where the money came from. I loved telling people, I work in an office. It made me feel like I had become an adult, but something strange started to happen, very slowly, so slowly that I didn't notice it at first. The excitement disappeared, not all at once, just a little bit, every week. The work became repetitive. The conversations became predictable. Even the jokes people told started to sound the same. Every day began to feel like a copy of the day before, and every week felt like it passed faster than the last. I told myself this was normal. I told myself this was what adulthood looked like. I told myself that feeling bored was better than feeling uncertain, and for a while, I believed it. But then one evening changed everything. It was a Friday. I stayed late at the office to finish a report. Most people had already gone home. The lights were dim. The building was quiet. As I packed my bag, I looked around the room. The empty desks, the silent computers, the rows of chairs, all facing the same direction. And suddenly, I had a thought I couldn't ignore. What if this is my life? For the next 30 years. Not just this job, but this routine, this feeling, this quiet, comfortable emptiness. That thought stayed with me all weekend. I tried to distract myself. I met friends. I watched movies. I scrolled through my phone for hours. But the question didn't go away. It followed me into Monday morning. It sat next to me at my desk. It watched me open my emails. It whispered to me while I worked. What if this is it? And for the first time, I felt afraid, not of losing something, but of never changing anything. That was the moment the decision began, not the action, not the result, just the beginning of a question. Should I stay or should I leave? Now, leaving a stable job doesn't sound logical, especially when you don't have a plan, especially when people around you expect you to be grateful, especially when nothing is wrong. That's what made it risky. There was no crisis, no dramatic reason, no clear sign that I needed to go. Just a quiet feeling, a feeling that something wasn't right. For weeks, I said nothing. I kept working. I kept smiling. I kept telling people everything was fine. But inside, something was changing. I started noticing things I had ignored before. How tired I felt every morning, how I counted the hours until the day ended, how I felt more alive on Sunday nights than Monday mornings. I began to ask myself questions I had never asked before. What do I actually want? What kind of life am I building? And is this really it? But questions are dangerous because once you start asking them, you can't go back. One day during lunch, a colleague sat next to me. He had been working there for almost 15 years. He was kind, reliable, respected by everyone. We talked about small things at first: work, deadlines, weekend plans. Then he said something that stayed with me. "I used to have so many ideas when I was your age." I smiled and asked, "What kind of ideas?" He laughed softly. "I don't even remember anymore." He said it casually, like it didn't matter, but for some reason, it hit me deeply. I looked at him and wondered, will that be me one day? Not unhappy, not struggling, just quietly forgetting who I used to be. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about his words, about the office, about the routine, about the version of myself I might become if I stayed. And for the first time, the safe choice started to feel dangerous. A few days later, I opened my laptop at home, not for work, but for something else. I started searching different jobs, different cities, different possibilities. At first, it felt exciting, like opening a door I didn't know existed. But very quickly, the fear came back. What if I fail? What if I regret it? What if I lose everything I've already built? These questions were louder than my curiosity, stronger than my desire to change. So I closed the laptop, and for a few days, I did nothing. This is something people don't talk about: the time between knowing you want change and actually doing something about it. It's uncomfortable, confusing, and very, very quiet. No one sees it, no one understands it, but inside, it feels like everything is shifting. Weeks passed. I continued my routine, but now everything felt different. Not because the job had changed, but because I had changed. I could no longer pretend that I didn't see the truth. I could no longer convince myself that I was satisfied. And that's when the first real step happened. It was a simple action, small, almost invisible to everyone else. I started saying yes to things I used to avoid: a weekend workshop, an online course, a conversation with a stranger who worked in a different field. These weren't big decisions, but they were different. And different is where change begins. Slowly, my world expanded, not dramatically, not instantly, but enough for me to see that there were other ways to live, other paths, other rhythms, other possibilities. And then, one morning, something unexpected happened. I woke up and I knew, not logically, not perfectly, but clearly enough, I couldn't stay anymore. The fear was still there, the uncertainty was still there, but the idea of staying felt heavier than the risk of leaving. That's when I realized something important. Sometimes a decision isn't about confidence, it's about honesty. And in that moment, I was finally honest with myself. I didn't love this life. And if I stayed, I might slowly lose the chance to build one that I did. That realization didn't make things easier, but it made things clear. The next step would be even harder, because thinking about change is very different from choosing it. And what I did next was the first truly risky decision of my life. There is a quiet moment before every big decision, a moment that doesn't look important, a moment that most people ignore. But if you pay attention, it tells you everything. For me, that moment came on a Tuesday morning. Nothing special about that day. No dramatic event, no sudden change. Just another normal day. That didn't feel normal anymore. I sat at my desk, opened my computer, checked my emails, read the same kind of messages I had read hundreds of times before. But something inside me had shifted. I wasn't just doing my job anymore. I was watching myself do it. Every click, every reply, every small task. It all felt distant, like I was observing someone else living my life. And then, without planning it, I opened a blank document. Not for work, not for any assignment. Just a blank page. At the top, I wrote one simple question. What happens if I leave? I stared at that question for a long time, because it didn't just ask about my job, it asked about my entire life. Slowly, I started writing. If I leave, I might lose my stable income. I might disappoint my parents. I might feel lost. I might fail. Each sentence made my chest feel tighter. But then, after a long pause, I wrote something else. If I stay, I might never know what else is possible. And I might become someone I don't recognize. I might forget what I once wanted. I might regret it. And suddenly, the second list felt heavier than the first. That was the first time I understood something clearly. Risk is not always about what you might lose. Sometimes, it's about what you might never gain. That day, I didn't quit. I didn't make any big move. But something important had changed. I had stopped lying to myself. The days after that became more intense. Not on the outside. Everything looked the same. But inside, everything felt louder. Every conversation felt more meaningful. Every small frustration felt bigger. Every moment of boredom felt unbearable. It was like once you see the truth, you can't unsee it. I began to notice how people talked about their lives. At lunch, in meetings, during coffee breaks. Some people complained, some people joked, some people stayed silent, but very few people questioned anything. That scared me more than failure. One evening, I called an old friend. We hadn't spoken in a long time. He had taken a very different path. He didn't have a stable job. He worked on different projects. Sometimes he had money, sometimes he didn't. From the outside, his life looked uncertain, maybe even risky. But when we talked, he sounded alive. I asked him a simple question. Are you ever scared? He laughed. Of course, all the time. I waited for him to say something reassuring. Something like, but it's worth it. But he didn't say that. Instead, he said something I didn't expect. I am more scared of being comfortable for too long. That sentence stayed with me because it described exactly what I was feeling, but I had never said it out loud. We talked for a long time that night about work, about choices, about the future. Before we ended the call, he asked me something. What do you actually want? Not what is safe, not what is expected, not what looks good on paper. What do you want? I didn't answer right away because I didn't know. And that was the problem. For years, I had been making decisions based on what made sense, what was logical, what was accepted. But I had never asked myself, what felt right? That question followed me for days. I wrote it down. I thought about it while walking, while eating, while trying to sleep. And slowly, small answers started to appear. Not clear answers, not perfect answers, just small hints. I wanted more freedom. I wanted to try different things. I wanted to feel challenged again. I wanted to feel awake. These weren't big dreams. They weren't specific plans, but they were real. And for the first time in a long time, they felt honest. The problem was, honest answers often lead to difficult decisions. I knew what I wanted, at least a little, but I also knew what it would cost: stability, comfort, approval from others. And that's where the real struggle began. Every morning, I told myself to wait, to think more, to be responsible. Every night, a different voice spoke. Life is short. You're wasting time. You already know the answer. This internal conversation became exhausting, but it also made something clear. There was no perfect time, no perfect plan, no moment when everything would feel safe. If I waited for certainty, I might wait forever. One Friday afternoon, my manager called me into his office. Nothing unusual, just a regular meeting. We talked about my performance, my progress, my future in the company. He smiled and said, "We see a long-term path for you here." It was meant to be good news, and part of me knew it was. A promotion, more responsibility, more stability, everything I had once wanted. But instead of feeling happy, I felt trapped. Not because the opportunity was bad, but because it was clear. Clear in a way that left no space for change. I nodded. I smiled. I said thank you. But inside, I knew. If I said yes to this, I was also saying no to something else. And that was the moment the decision became real. That night, I went home and sat in silence. No music, no distractions, just me and my thoughts. I opened that same document again, the one with the question, "What happens if I leave?" This time, I didn't write a list. I wrote one sentence. I choose uncertainty over regret. My hands were shaking, not because I didn't know what it meant, but because I did. The next step was obvious, but it was also the hardest part: action. Thinking is safe, planning is safe, imagining is safe, but acting changes everything. The next morning, I woke up earlier than usual. I got dressed, prepared for work. Everything felt normal, and at the same time, completely different. I looked at myself in the mirror, and for a moment I hesitated. This was the last chance to go back, to stay comfortable, to choose the safe path. But then I remembered something. If I didn't do this now, I might never do it. So I took a deep breath and left the house. The walk to the office felt longer than usual. Every step felt heavy. Every thought felt louder. I arrived, said hello to my colleagues, sat at my desk, and then I did something I had never done before. I opened a new document, not a question this time. A letter, short, simple, clear, a resignation letter. I read it once, twice, 3 times. Each time my heart beat faster. This was no longer an idea, no longer a possibility. This was real. I stood up, walked to my manager's office, knocked on their door. And in that moment, everything became silent. No more overthinking, no more fear, no more waiting. Just one decision, finally becoming action. There is a moment, right after you make a big decision, when everything becomes very quiet. Not peaceful quiet, not relaxing quiet, but the kind of quiet that feels unfamiliar. That was the feeling when I closed the door behind me after handing in my resignation, after saying the words out loud, after turning a thought into reality. I walked out of the office building slowly, not because I wanted to, but because I didn't know how to feel. Nothing around me had changed. People were still walking, cars were still moving, the city was still alive. But inside, everything felt different. For months, I had been thinking about leaving, imagining it, fearing it, planning it. And now, it was done. There was no more what if, only what now. That question followed me all the way home. At first, I expected to feel relief, freedom, excitement, but what I felt instead was uncertainty, heavy, uncomfortable, real. That night, I sat on my bed and stared at the ceiling. No schedule for tomorrow, no clear direction, no plan, just space. And for the first time in years, I didn't know what my life would look like next week. That should have felt exciting, but it didn't. It felt scary because structure had always protected me. Routine had always guided me. Certainty had always comforted me. And now, all of that was gone. The next morning, I woke up early out of habit. My body still believed I had somewhere to go. For a few seconds, everything felt normal. Then I remembered. I wasn't going back. I stayed in bed longer than usual, not because I was tired, but because I didn't know what to do. This is something people don't talk about. The moment after you choose freedom, when it doesn't feel like freedom at all. It feels like confusion. I got up, made coffee, sat by the window. The city outside looked the same, but I didn't feel like part of it anymore. For years, I had followed a rhythm. Wake up, go to work, complete tasks, come home, repeat. Now that rhythm was gone, and without it, I felt lost. The first few days passed slowly, very slowly. I tried to stay productive. I told myself I needed to use this time wisely. I made lists, things to learn, things to try, things to fix in my life. But every time I started something, my mind wandered. What if I made a mistake? That thought appeared again and again. It didn't shout. It didn't panic. It just stayed there, quietly. And the more I tried to ignore it, the stronger it became. I began to question everything. Was I too impulsive? Was I ungrateful? Was I unrealistic? These thoughts didn't come from nowhere. They came from years of conditioning, from what I had been taught, from what society expected, from what responsibility looked like. Leaving a stable job without a plan didn't fit that image. And so, doubt started to grow. One afternoon, I met my parents. I had delayed this conversation, not because I didn't care, but because I knew it wouldn't be easy. We sat together, a simple meal, familiar surroundings. At first, we talked about normal things, food, weather, family news. Then, I told them. I tried to sound calm, confident, certain, but my voice wasn't steady. There was a pause after I finished speaking. A long pause. My mother looked at me, concerned, confused. My father didn't say anything at first. He just nodded slowly. Then he asked, "Do you have another job?" I shook my head. Another pause. Not angry, not dramatic. Just heavy. "We just want you to be safe," my mother said quietly. I understood what she meant. Safety, stability, security, the things I had just walked away from. "I'll be okay," I said, even though I wasn't completely sure. That conversation stayed with me for days, not because they were wrong, but because they were right, in their own way. From their perspective, I had taken a risk that didn't make sense, and that made me question myself even more. That's another truth people don't talk about. When you choose a different path, you don't just fight your own fears. You also carry the fears of others, their doubts, their worries, their expectations, and sometimes those are even heavier than your own. A week passed, then two. I was no longer on vacation. I was officially unemployed. That word felt strange, unemployed. It carried a weight I hadn't expected, a quiet pressure, a subtle judgment. Even when no one said anything, I felt it. I started to avoid certain questions. What are you doing now? What's your plan? I didn't have clear answers, and that made me uncomfortable, so I kept things vague. I'm exploring. I'm figuring things out. But inside, I was still searching. One day, while walking through the city, I noticed something small. People were rushing, checking their phones, moving quickly from one place to another, just like I used to, and for a moment, I felt something unexpected. Not regret, not jealousy, but distance. I was no longer part of that system, at least for now. And that gave me a strange sense of perspective. For the first time, I could observe life without being controlled by it. That realization didn't solve my problems, but it changed how I saw them. Maybe this period wasn't about having answers. Maybe it was about asking better questions. So I stopped trying to control everything, stopped forcing myself to be productive all the time. Instead, I started paying attention to what interested me, to what gave me energy, to what made me feel curious. I read more, not because I had to, but because I wanted to. I listened to conversations, watched how people lived, noticed things I had ignored before. Slowly, something began to shift again. Not a big change, not a clear direction, but a feeling that this uncertainty might actually be necessary, that maybe this confusion was part of the process, because without it, I would have gone back to something familiar, something safe, but not right. Then, one afternoon, I received a message from someone I barely knew. We had met once at a workshop, just a short conversation. The message was simple. Hey, I remember you mentioned you were interested in trying new things. I'm working on a small project. It's not stable, not guaranteed, but maybe you'd like to join for a while? I read the message twice. It wasn't a job, not really. No promises, no security, just an opportunity, a small one. The old version of me would have said no. Too risky, too uncertain. But now, I saw it differently. This wasn't about security anymore. It was about movement, about taking the next step, even if I couldn't see the whole path. I didn't think too long, because I knew what thinking would do. It would bring back fear, doubt, excuses. So instead, I replied with one word: yes. That was the second risky decision. Not as dramatic as quitting my job, but just as important. Because this time, I wasn't leaving something. I was stepping into something unknown. And that is where real change begins. Saying yes to something uncertain feels very different from imagining it. When I sent that message, when I agreed to join that small project, I felt a brief moment of excitement, a sense of movement, a sense that something new was beginning. But that feeling didn't last long, because reality is always quieter than imagination. The next morning, I woke up and realized something simple. There was no structure, no clear role, no guarantee of success, just an idea, a small team, and a lot of unknowns. I remember opening my laptop, waiting for instructions, waiting for clarity, waiting for someone to tell me exactly what to do. But nothing came. No detailed plan, no step-by-step guide, no certainty. At first, I thought something was wrong. Maybe I misunderstood. Maybe I wasn't needed. Maybe I wasn't good enough to contribute. But then I realized this is what uncertainty looks like. No one has all the answers. No one is completely ready. Everyone is figuring things out as they go. That realization was uncomfortable, but also freeing. Because for the first time, I didn't have to be perfect. I just had to try. The project itself was simple, at least on the surface. We were trying to build something small, a service, an idea that might help people or might fail completely. There was no guarantee, and that made every decision feel heavier. What direction should we take? What should we focus on? What actually matters? In my old job, these questions had clear answers. There were rules, systems, expectations. Here, there was only judgment, my judgment, and that was terrifying. Because when things go wrong in a structured system, you can blame the system. But when you are part of something uncertain, you start blaming yourself. The first week was difficult, not because of the work, but because of the silence. No clear feedback, no immediate results, no sense of progress. I began to doubt everything again. Was this a mistake? Should I go back? Did I leave something stable? For nothing. These thoughts returned quietly, just like before. But this time, I didn't run away from them. Instead, I observed them. I noticed when they appeared. I noticed what triggered them. I noticed how they made me feel, and slowly, I started to understand something important. Fear doesn't always mean you are on the wrong path. Sometimes, it means you are on a new one. That idea didn't remove the fear, but it changed how I responded to it. Instead of stopping, I kept going, one small step at a time. I contributed ideas, even when I wasn't sure. I asked questions, even when I felt uncertain. I tried things, even when they might fail, and many of them did fail. Ideas didn't work, plans didn't succeed, efforts didn't lead to results. At first, each failure felt personal, like proof that I wasn't capable, like evidence that I had made the wrong decision. But over time, something shifted again. Failure became information, not judgment, not identity, just feedback. This was very different from my old life. In my previous job, mistakes were something to avoid, something to hide, something that could affect your reputation. Here, mistakes were a part of the process, expected, accepted, even necessary. That didn't make them easy, but it made them meaningful. One day, after a long discussion with the team, we realized something important. We had been focusing on the wrong problem. For weeks, we had been building something that didn't truly matter. At first, that realization felt like failure, lost time, wasted effort. But then, it felt like progress. Because now, we understood more. We adjusted, changed direction, started again. That experience taught me something I had never learned before. Progress is not always forward. Sometimes, it looks like starting over. And that's okay. Another challenge appeared slowly, not in the work itself, but in my life outside of it. Money. For the first time in years, I didn't have a stable income. At the beginning, I didn't think much about it. I had some savings, enough to feel safe for a while, but for a while is not forever. Every time I spent money, I became more aware of it. Food, rent, small daily expenses, things I had never questioned before, now felt important. I started calculating everything, planning, adjusting, and with that, a new kind of pressure appeared. Not emotional, not social, but practical, real. This was different from fear. This was responsibility, and it forced me to think differently. Before I worked for stability, now I needed to create it. That shift changed everything. I started to take my time more seriously, my energy more carefully, my decisions more consciously. Not because someone told me to, but because it mattered. I began to understand something deeper. Freedom is not just about having no structure. It's about creating your own. And that is much harder because there are no rules, no clear boundaries, no guaranteed results, only choices and consequences. Weeks turned into months. The project didn't become a big success, at least not in the way I expected, but something else happened. I changed, not suddenly, not dramatically, but quietly. I became more comfortable with uncertainty, more patient with progress, more aware of myself. I learned how to sit with discomfort without running away. I learned how to move forward without needing full clarity. I learned how to trust small steps, even when the outcome was unclear. These lessons didn't come easily. They came through doubt, through failure, through moments when I wanted to quit, and there were many of those moments. One evening, I sat alone again, just like before, but this time, the feeling was different. Not lost, not confused, just thoughtful. I looked back at the past few months, at the decision to leave, at the uncertainty, at the struggles, and I asked myself a simple question. Was it worth it? The answer didn't come immediately. Because the truth is, it depends on what you expect. If you expect quick success, then maybe not. If you expect clear results, then maybe not. But if you look deeper, if you pay attention to what changed inside you, then the answer becomes clearer. Yes, not because everything worked out, but because I was no longer the same person. And that mattered more than I expected. That was when I understood something important. Risky decisions don't always change your life by changing your situation. Sometimes they change how you see everything, and that changes what you do next. Because this was only the beginning. The first decision had taken me out of my old life. The second decision had brought me into uncertainty. But there were still more decisions ahead. And the next one would be even more unexpected. There is a point in every journey when you stop asking, was this the right decision? And you start asking something else. What am I going to do with this now? That question came to me slowly, not in one moment, not in one clear realization, but through many quiet days where nothing special happened, yet everything continued to change. The project I had joined continued for a while. We made progress. Then we lost it. We tried new ideas. Some worked, most didn't. It wasn't a straight path. It wasn't even a clear path, but it was real. And for the first time in my life, I was part of something that didn't promise results, only experience. One afternoon, after a long meeting, we all sat in silence, not because we had nothing to say, but because we were tired, tired of trying, tired of adjusting, tired of not knowing. Someone finally spoke. I don't think this is working. No one argued, because deep down, we all knew it was true. The project wasn't failing dramatically. There was no big collapse, no sudden ending. It was just slowly fading, losing energy, losing direction, losing purpose. And that kind of ending is often harder than a clear failure because there is no clear moment to stop, no clear decision, just a quiet realization that it's time to let go. That was the third risky decision, walking away again. Not because I had something better, not because I had a new plan, but because I had learned enough to know this was no longer right. This time, the feeling was different. On the first time I left my job, I was afraid of losing stability. The second time I said yes to uncertainty, I was afraid of failing. But this time, I wasn't afraid in the same way. I understood something I didn't understand before. Not every path is meant to last. Some are meant to teach you, and then end. Letting go of the project wasn't easy, but it didn't break me. Because I had changed, I had become someone who could begin again. And that made all the difference. The days after that felt strange, familiar, yet different. Once again, I had space. Once again, I had no clear direction. But this time, I wasn't lost. I was open, open to new ideas, open to new possibilities, open to new versions of myself. And that's when something unexpected happened. I stopped looking for the perfect opportunity. I stopped asking, what should I do next? Instead, I started asking, what can I build with what I already have? That question changed everything because for the first time, I wasn't waiting for something external. I was creating something internal. I looked at my skills, my experiences, my interests, not as separate things, but as pieces of something I could combine. I had learned how to observe, how to write, how to think, how to sit with uncertainty. These didn't look like valuable skills at first, not in the traditional sense, but they were real, and they were mine. So I started small, very small. I began writing regularly, not for a company, not for money, just to express something. At first, it felt uncomfortable, slow, uncertain, but over time, it became natural. I didn't force it. I didn't rush it. I just kept going, one piece at a time. Then, something interesting happened. People started responding. Not a lot of people, not immediately, but enough to notice. They connected with the stories, with the thoughts, with the honesty. And for the first time, I saw something I hadn't seen before. Value, not in a job title, not in a salary, but in what I could create. That realization was quiet, but powerful, because it showed me something important. You don't always need to find a path. Sometimes you create one. That became the fourth risky decision, to trust something small, something uncertain, something that didn't have clear rewards. At the beginning, it didn't bring money. It didn't bring recognition. It didn't bring stability, but it brought something else, meaning, and that was enough to continue. Days turned into weeks. Weeks turned into months. The work grew slowly, very slowly, but it grew. Not because I forced it, but because I stayed with it. Through doubt, through uncertainty, through moments when nothing seemed to happen. And then, one day, something shifted again. An opportunity appeared, not out of nowhere, but as a result of everything I had been doing. Someone reached out. They had read something I wrote. They connected with it, and they had a proposal. Not a perfect one, not a guaranteed success, but a real opportunity. This time, the decision felt different, not because it was easier, but because I was different. I didn't need certainty anymore. I didn't need everything to be clear. I only needed one thing: alignment. Does this feel right? Does this move me forward? Does this match who I am becoming? The answer was yes, so I said yes again. That was the fifth risky decision. Not driven by fear, not driven by escape, but driven by understanding. And that's when I realized something that took me years to learn. Risk is not the enemy. Avoiding risk can be, because every time you avoid risk, you also avoid growth. You avoid discovery. You avoid change. You avoid becoming someone new. Looking back now, those decisions didn't make my life perfect. They didn't remove uncertainty. They didn't guarantee success, but they did something more important. They gave me direction. Not a fixed direction, not a predictable path, but a living one. A path that changes as I change. A path that grows as I grow. And maybe that's what life is really about. Not finding the safest road, not avoiding every mistake, but choosing again and again to move forward, even when you don't have all the answers. So if you are standing at a crossroads right now, if you are asking yourself, should I stay or should I leave? Maybe the better question is this: Who will I become if I don't? Because sometimes the biggest risk is staying the same. Thank you for being here. Thank you for listening. And if this story made you think, even just a little, then maybe you are already closer to your next decision than you realize. Take your time. Listen to yourself. And when the moment comes, be honest, because that's where every real change begins.